Tiffany Henyard's tumultuous tenure as mayor of Dalton, Illinois. Tiffany Henyard's time as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, began with promises of reform and transparency, but quickly descended into controversy, marked by allegations of corruption, financial mismanagement, and growing public dissatisfaction. Initially seen as a fresh face in local politics, her tenure ultimately became synonymous with dysfunction, poor leadership, and scandal. Henyard's rapid rise to power came after the unexpected death of long-serving Mayor Frank Zuccarelli. In the wake of his passing, the Dalton Board of Trustees appointed Henyard as his replacement in a decision criticized for its lack of transparency and public input. Many believe the appointment was a result of behind-the-scenes political maneuvering rather than her qualifications, casting doubt on the legitimacy of her leadership from the outset almost immediately. Henyard's leadership style alienated both officials and residents. One of her first major decisions, hiring a criminal inspector without board approval, sparked widespread concern about her unwillingness to follow proper governance procedures. This move was followed by her controversial use of Dalton police officers as personal security, a decision viewed as an abuse of public resources and indicative of a self-serving leadership style. Despite campaigning on civic engagement, Henyard repeatedly failed to address pressing community needs. Her rejection of a mental health tax proposal, alongside her consistent disregard for resident and trustee concerns, created a rift between the mayor's office and the public. Her increasingly authoritarian leadership was exemplified by the dismissal of key officials, including Jessica Jones and Stephanie Whitman. Firings widely perceived as politically motivated rather than based on performance. One of the most shocking incidents during Henyard's tenure involved Township Assessor Cass Sandstone, who was allegedly locked out of her office following a heated dispute with the mayor. This event became emblematic of Henyard's confrontational and erratic approach to governance. Public trust further deteriorated when Sandstone and a colleague discovered confidential documents containing sensitive resident information left unattended outside Henyard's office. This significant breach of privacy raised alarm over the administration's ability to handle sensitive data and protect citizen information. As public outrage intensified, Henyard faced mounting accusations of corruption, including allegations of embezzlement and misuse of public funds. Yet she refused to step down, claiming she was a victim of a politically motivated conspiracy. These denials, however, failed to quell the growing unrest among residents and officials alike. The situation escalated further when the FBI launched an investigation into her financial activities, further undermining her credibility and fueling speculation about the depth of misconduct within her administration. Approval ratings for Henyard plummeted. Even among her previous supporters, confidence eroded as missteps accumulated and scandals mounted. One of the most baffling decisions came when Henyard suddenly relocated the assessor's office, claiming the move was due to excessive heat that made the original office unusable. Critics noted the absence of formal documentation or announcements supporting her claim, interpreting the move as yet another example of mismanagement and questionable judgment, though Henyard insisted the relocation was part of a broader initiative to improve resident services. Her explanation was met with skepticism. In the context of her administration's ongoing lack of transparency, deteriorating services, and hostile leadership style, many saw the move as further evidence of disarray. Even her allies began to distance themselves, calling for accountability and reforms as public pressure reached a boiling point. What began as a hopeful new chapter for Dalton devolved into one of the most controversial and damaging mayoral administrations in the town's history. Henyard's term left behind broken trust, administrative chaos, and deep uncertainty for the community. Although Dalton had received external funding during her tenure, these financial resources did little to offset the political turmoil and reputational damage her leadership brought to the village. The fallout from her leadership continued to spread. As legal challenges mounted, Henyard's grip on power grew increasingly tenuous. The initial controversy surrounding her appointment, rushed, opaque, and politically charged, set the tone for an administration that many now view as a cautionary tale of failed leadership. Instead of responding to criticism with humility and engagement, Henyard grew more combative, isolated herself from the public, and fellow officials' public meetings became highly controlled. Media access was restricted, and reporters were frequently prevented from asking challenging questions. These evasive tactics only deepened public suspicion and widened the rift between Henyard and the residents she vowed to serve. Even her most vocal supporter, Keith Freeman, struggled to contain the growing backlash and frustration from the community. In the face of escalating scrutiny, Henyard began to shift her narrative. Abandoning political justifications, she framed her embattled role as a spiritual trial, often asserting that God had placed her in her position to endure hardship. While this rhetoric may have resonated with some, for many it seemed a deflection from the concrete issues plaguing her administration. Her religious appeals did little to repair the damage or restore public trust. The controversial relocation of the assessor's office came to symbolize everything critics found troubling about Henyard's leadership: a lack of transparency, disregard for public opinion, administrative negligence, and an unwillingness to take accountability. Her insistence on dismissing media reports and characterizing legitimate concerns as mere rumors failed to persuade a public already disillusioned by her pattern of secrecy and mismanagement. Ultimately, Tiffany Henyard's time as mayor of Dalton will likely be remembered as a period of intense scandal, internal strife, and eroded public confidence. What began with the promise of new leadership turned into a case study in poor governance. Her administration became defined not by progress, but by chaos and mistrust, leaving Dalton residents longing for a new direction, one rooted in transparency, accountability, and a sincere commitment to serving the public. Would you like this formatted for a blog post, newsletter, or article layout? A cautionary tale. Tiffany Henyard's troubled tenure in Dalton, Illinois. Tiffany Henyard once stood as a beacon of promise for the town of Dalton, Illinois. Elected on a platform of reform, transparency, and community revitalization, she was seen as a fresh voice who could restore trust and usher in a new era of civic leadership. However, that promise quickly unraveled into a series of controversies, legal challenges, and widespread public disillusionment as dissatisfaction grew. Henyard's response only deepened the divide between her and the community she vowed to serve. Instead of addressing the core issues facing Dalton, fiscal instability, lack of transparency, and deteriorating public services, she doubled down on a narrative of victimhood. She framed herself as a righteous figure under siege, repeatedly suggesting that her leadership was divinely ordained rather than inspiring confidence to spiritual. Rhetoric came across to many as a deflection tactic, distancing her from accountability and frustrating residents who were demanding concrete answers. Her confrontational approach reached new heights when local media began reporting on restrictions to press access during key public meetings. Rather than respond with clarity or openness, Henyard accused journalists of spreading fake news and failing to do proper research. This hostile stance only reinforced the perception that her administration operated in secrecy and was unwilling to face scrutiny. One of Henyard's most vocal supporters, Keith Freeman, echoed her spiritual framing, insisting she had been chosen to lead. Yet this narrative failed to resonate with many in the community, who saw Dalton's struggles not as divine tests, but as direct consequences of poor leadership, mismanagement, and unchecked ambition. As investigations into her conduct mounted, particularly those led by the FBI and other agencies, Henyard's approval ratings continued to plummet. Once regarded as a symbol of change, her administration became defined by internal conflict, secrecy, and an alarming disconnect from the everyday realities faced by residents. The situation deteriorated further with a string of damaging legal developments. One of the most serious was a lawsuit filed by a Dalton police officer who had served as part of Henyard's personal security detail. The officer accused Henyard of misusing city resources to provide private protection, an especially damning allegation given Dalton's already precarious financial state. The case highlighted not just questionable ethical practices, but also the misuse of taxpayer money for personal benefit. Henyard's administration also drew criticism for hiring former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot at a reported $400 per hour to investigate allegations of financial mismanagement, an eyebrow-raising decision that many saw as an effort to appear responsive without addressing the root problems. The move was widely perceived as tone-deaf and politically motivated, especially by residents who were already struggling with the town's lack of services and deteriorating infrastructure. Further compounding public outrage was the revelation of a taxpayer-funded $26,000 trip to Las Vegas, an extravagant expense seen as wildly out of step with Dalton's financial reality. Even more concerning was the discovery that nearly $900,000 had been paid to a local prosecutor who failed to file criminal charges, a situation that raised serious concerns about corruption and the misuse of legal mechanisms for political shielding. Henyard continued to deflect criticism, frequently framing investigations into her conduct as racially motivated political attacks. While this claim found limited sympathy, most residents viewed it as a diversion from a growing mountain of evidence suggesting financial impropriety and abuse of power. Rather than address legitimate concerns, Henyard repeatedly sought to recast herself as a victim of external forces, a tactic that only further alienated her from the public. The mounting legal and ethical scandals culminated in federal subpoenas issued to members of Henyard's political committee and several of her relatives. This development signaled that the scope of the investigation had broadened significantly and suggested a deep network of alleged misconduct reaching beyond Henyard herself. Throughout the ongoing turmoil, Henyard showed little willingness to bridge the divide with Dalton citizens. Public meetings remained tightly controlled. Media questions were routinely cut off, and meaningful dialogue with residents was virtually non-existent. Instead of using her platform to unify and lead through crisis, Henyard seemed increasingly isolated, retreating behind spiritual rhetoric and combative defenses. One particularly contentious moment came during a public meeting, when Henyard lashed out at a reporter who questioned her administration's media restrictions. Rather than responding with facts or transparency, she again accused the press of spreading falsehoods, an exchange that symbolized her administration's broader failure to embrace accountability. By this point, even former supporters had begun calling for her resignation, recognizing that Henyard's continued presence in office was doing more harm than good. Legal challenges, public outrage, and investigative scrutiny had all but destroyed any remaining trust in her leadership. What had begun as a hopeful new chapter for Dalton became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked political power, a lack of transparency, and a failure to place community needs above personal ambition. Henyard's spiritual justifications, her resistance to accountability, and her combative stance toward critics have left Dalton reeling from a prolonged period of instability. Whether her political career ends with her time in office or she attempts to persist despite overwhelming controversy remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. Tiffany Henyard's tenure has left a deep scar on the community of Dalton, a legacy of chaos, broken trust, and missed opportunities. Rebuilding from this chapter will require not just new leadership, but recommitment to the principles of transparency, responsibility, and genuine public service. Here's your rewritten and polished passage at approximately 894 words, structured for clarity and emphasis, while keeping all the key points and tone intact. The collapse of a promised reform. Tiffany Henyard's tumultuous legacy in Dalton, once seen as a rising political star and a symbol of reform. Tiffany Henyard's tenure as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, has unraveled into a case study of power misused, trust broken, and a community left reeling. What began with promises of change and revitalization devolved into a scandal-ridden administration marred by secrecy, corruption, and deepening public disillusionment. As federal investigations expanded and new allegations emerged, it became clear that the issues went far beyond Henyard herself. The reach of the probe suggested that multiple layers of her administration were potentially involved, painting a picture of systemic dysfunction. For the residents of Dalton, each new revelation raised unsettling questions about how deep the corruption ran, and whether the town could ever truly recover. The damage was not limited to headlines and courtrooms. The fallout from Henyard's leadership was felt in every corner of the community. Public trust, once cautiously invested in a mayor who promised transparency and reform, was shattered. What had once been seen as a new chapter of civic renewal turned into a cautionary tale of mismanagement and betrayal. Henyard's pattern of blaming external forces only deepened public frustration. Rather than acknowledge the mounting legal and ethical concerns, she framed the investigations and criticism as racially motivated attacks. While some sympathized with this defense, many more saw it as a diversion from the real issues: unchecked spending, lack of transparency, and a disregard for the needs of the community. Among the most damaging revelations were accusations that Henyard had misused public funds to secure personal protection and had retaliated against staff who challenged her. A lawsuit filed by a member of her personal security detail accused her of using city resources for private security, an especially troubling charge given Dalton's fragile finances. Reports of retaliatory firings further highlighted a governance style defined by favoritism and fear rather than public service. The tipping point for many residents came with the exposure of a taxpayer-funded $26,000 trip to Las Vegas. In a town facing economic hardship, this extravagant expense was seen as a glaring sign of misaligned priorities. It reinforced a growing sentiment that Henyard's administration was more concerned with personal comfort and image than with addressing the real struggles facing the people of Dalton. Even more disturbing were reports that nearly $900,000 had been paid to a local prosecutor who failed to pursue any criminal charges, despite a growing body of allegations and complaints. This raised serious concerns about collusion, political shielding, and the erosion of legal accountability. As the federal investigation intensified, subpoenas were issued targeting a wide range of records, payroll documents, travel logs, credit card transactions, and more. These demands painted a picture of a government in crisis, plagued by nepotism, cronyism, and a failure to uphold even basic standards of public accountability. The widening scope of the probe suggested that the rot extended beyond Henyard to a broader network of allies and officials complicit in the dysfunction. Despite the mounting evidence, Henyard continued to present herself as a victim of political attacks. This refusal to engage honestly with the community's concerns only deepened the divide. Instead of leading with humility and transparency, she clung to a defensive posture, alienating even former supporters. Each press conference and public appearance seemed to bring further controversy. Confrontations with journalists questioning her administration's secrecy and spending were met not with transparency, but with accusations of fake news. Rather than clear the air, these moments only reinforced perception that Henyard's administration had lost touch with community. The hiring of former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot at a rate of $400 per hour to investigate allegations against Henyard herself was met with disbelief. Residents viewed the move not as an act of accountability, but as a calculated distraction, an expensive one at that. With basic services underfunded and infrastructure crumbling, spending public funds to investigate oneself came across as self-serving and disingenuous. As the scandal deepened, the legal consequences became harder to ignore. Federal subpoenas extended to Henyard's political committee and even members of her family, suggesting a far-reaching web of questionable financial activity. The depth of the investigation indicated a systemic breakdown in governance, one that would take years, perhaps decades, to undo. Dalton is now left grappling with the aftermath. The sense of betrayal runs deep, not just because of the scandals themselves, but because of the hopes that were dashed in the process. Henyard had promised transformation. Instead, she delivered turmoil. Her time in office, marked by escalating legal challenges, financial mismanagement, and the silencing of dissent, has left an indelible mark on the town's political and social fabric. Whether Henyard will face legal consequences remains to be seen. But her political legacy is already clear. A tenure once filled with promise is now synonymous with dysfunction, controversy, and lost trust. Her downfall serves as a sobering lesson about the dangers of unchecked power, the consequences of prioritizing personal gain over public service, and the critical importance of accountability in a healthy democracy. As Dalton looks to the future, the path to recovery will be difficult. Rebuilding trust, restoring transparency, and holding those responsible to account will require time, resilience, and new leadership committed to putting the community first. The scars left by Henyard's administration may never fully fade, but they can serve as a powerful reminder of the values that must guide public service: integrity, transparency, and a true commitment to people to follow the promised reformer. Tiffany Henyard's legacy further unravels. At the center of Dalton's ongoing political crisis remains Mayor Tiffany Henyard, but increasingly under scrutiny is her top aide, Keith Freeman. Freeman's role has come under intense examination amid accusations ranging from bankruptcy fraud to the failure to disclose key village revenues. His continued influence, not only in Dalton but also in nearby Thornton Township, has fueled speculation that he may be cooperating with federal investigators. If true, the implications could be even more explosive for Henyard's embattled administration. Despite the swirling legal challenges and growing public outrage, Henyard has remained defiant. She has consistently dismissed the allegations against her as politically motivated and racially charged, framing the investigations as efforts to undermine her authority as a black woman in power. However, for many residents, this narrative rang hollow. Critics accuse Henyard of using identity politics as a shield to avoid addressing the substance of the charges, deepening the divide between her and the community she once inspired. Public outrage reached new heights when reports surfaced detailing Henyard's extravagant spending of taxpayer dollars. In just 1 year, she reportedly spent over $12,000 on travel, including first-class airfare and luxury accommodations at establishments like the Four Seasons in Atlanta and the Marriott Marquis in New York City. One hotel stay was alleged to cost a staggering $133,000, a figure that came to symbolize the mayor's lavish and, to many, indefensible misuse of public funds. These revelations were especially troubling given Dalton's financial distress. As residents struggled with economic hardship and essential services suffered from underfunding, Henyard's spending was seen as a direct betrayal of her promise to prioritize the community's needs. Rather than investing in infrastructure, community programs, or public safety, she appeared to be indulging in a lifestyle far removed from the reality of her constituents. As more information surfaced, detailing inflated contracts, unchecked spending, and retaliatory actions against critics, the pressure for Henyard to resign grew unbearable. What had begun as a hopeful administration promising reform and accountability devolved into a litany of scandals, secrecy, and broken trust. Confidence in her leadership all but evaporated, and calls for her resignation grew louder and more unified by the day. The investigation, far from winding down, continued to expand. Federal authorities widened their focus beyond Henyard herself to include her political committee, a nonprofit charity linked to her, and several trustees, two of whom are believed to be her relatives. The issuance of multiple subpoenas suggested a far-reaching web of financial mismanagement and possible collusion that exceeded initial expectations. Whether Henyard will ultimately face criminal charges remains uncertain, but her political future appears irreparably damaged. Once seen as a beacon of change, she now stands as a cautionary symbol of failed leadership. Her tenure has left the town fractured and disillusioned, desperate for transparency, stability, and a return to ethical governance. The Henyard era which began with optimism and ambition, has ended in disappointment, controversy, and mistrust. For the residents of Dalton, many of whom once believed in her message of reform, the road ahead is uncertain. Rebuilding trust and restoring integrity to local government will take time and leadership grounded in accountability. The damage Henyard's administration has done will leave a lasting mark. But the lessons it offers about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of integrity in public office are ones the community will carry forward for years to come.